Okay, hello and welcome everyone to today's edition of the Moral Injury Support Network podcast. I'm your host, U.S. Army retired Lieutenant Colonel Jamie Peer, and I'm joined by my co-host and the founder and president of the Moral Injury Support Network for Servicewomen, Dr. Dan Roberts. Today, we have the privilege of welcoming a very distinguished guest to us, Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock. Dr. Brock, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on our podcast today. And we want to welcome a true luminary in the field of moral injury. Today, we are getting to highlight the impactful work that has left an indelible mark on the lives of those affected by moral injury. Dr. Brock is the Senior Vice President of Volunteers of America for the Moral Injury Programming. Her dedication to addressing moral injury is exemplified through her remarkable contributions, including the establishment of the Soul Repair Center and her extensive experience conducting trainings for professionals of diverse backgrounds. Her expertise has empowered countless individuals to navigate the complex terrain of moral injury, providing them with invaluable strategies and resources for healing and recovery. So again, Dr. Brock, thank you so much for joining us today. And to our audience, buckle up because we're about to embark on a journey of understanding, healing, and support under the expert guidance of Dr. Brock. Dan?
Hey, Dr. Brock, thanks so much for coming on our podcast. We've been kind of watching your work and the work of VOA and the Shea Center for some time now, and you you all are very much leading the way in moral injury research, moral injury education, support, all those kind of things. And I know you're doing a lot to help others who want to work in this space. So we really appreciate you coming on and look forward to just hearing from you and talking about things that can really help people that are listening. So thank you very much. I'm a big fan, and I appreciate you taking the time today.
Oh, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And I also think that normally when people start talking about veterans, they gender it as masculine. And I think there's more emerging research around service women and service women veterans that is important to understand that gender is a factor in how moral injury operates.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I appreciate you saying that because that is a big passion of mine, is just the nuances
Yeah.
of the gender experience in the military.
Mhm. And
Oh,
how it's not
oh,
very well equipped to deal with this,
Right,
right? It's
right,
great on
right.
some things, and on other things, it's got a long way to go. Let's put it that
Absolutely.
way. Yeah.
and that is
Yeah.
a big part of why we exist. And again, I appreciate you saying that because I have often encountered people who don't understand the military experience, and it's not their fault, right? But they don't
Yeah.
understand the military experience first off, and then layering the complexities of being a woman in the military, just a woman in our culture in
That,
general,
yes.
right? And then add
Right.
the military
Right.
to that.
Yeah.
And there are definitely very specific things that
Yeah.
we
And
encounter.
military service is kind of a gender bending occupation as it was for a woman, right? It's you enter a culture that's uh, strongly masculinized, for a lot of reasons. Some of them good reasons, but it is a different culture, and it's so embedded that people don't think about women as a separate group that is the way some VAs don't have an OBGYN on staff.
Mhm.
Things like that. Those are things that administrators might not even think of because a lot of them are male,
Correct.
or men. Yeah. So, and it's not, it's what is called implicit bias. It isn't deliberate. It isn't ill intended necessarily. It's just an implicit bias.
Yes.
Yeah.
I feel like we could do a whole series of podcasts with you.
Well, yeah, I've worked for when I worked in Fort Worth, Texas, when I started the Soul Repair Center in 2012 in Fort Worth, Texas, there was a Air Force fighter pilot named Kim Olson, who was just retired, and she was advocating for women veterans, and she told me this very simple example of a woman who had lost both her legs,
Mm.
and she was in a hospital in San Antonio, and she was physically recovering but was clearly depressed, and the staff in the hospital really liked her a lot and were really concerned about how depressed she was. And so at some points someone tried to talk to her, and it might have even been Kim, and what she said was, will I ever be pretty again?
Mm.
Which is, that's a serious, like, transitioning back to civilian society as a female. For a lot of women, that's an issue, how to become more like how they think a woman should be like. And so when they sort of pressed on that a little bit, it was that she wanted to wear high heels,
Mm.
and there were no prosthetics for that.
Mm.
So they asked the guy at the hospital who made the prosthetics if he could make a foot on a prosthetic that could wear high heels. And the guy said, I've never tried, but let me see. And he was able to make her feet that would fit in high heels. So the staff bought her a pair of Prada shoes so she could walk out of the hospital in high heels.
Oh my
Wow.
God.
Right. But no one ever, who would have thought of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That women's feet, they're not generic feet.
Right.
Right. So, and not all women want to wear high heels, but in her case, she wanted to, and they made that possible for her. And I know that they understood, they hadn't considered what she wanted to, in terms of what she needed to feel okay.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
it's very interesting.
Yeah.
And yes, I mean, I think there's so many, that's extremely nuanced example. I personally try to stay out of high heels as often as possible, break an ankle,
Yes.
but
But
there are those
Mhm.
moments where, I go to
yeah.
a with my husband who's 6'5". I can wear high heels and, I will do that for that. But to think that I would never be able to do that again
Yeah.
unless I had advocated for myself and asked for it. But that's another challenge that, culturally and societally, women are often reluctant to ask for what they want because we've
Right.
been trained to wait to be asked to the prom, wait to be asked to be married. It's very forward. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
that's very
Yeah,
interesting.
there's a book about women and salaries in corporate America called Women Don't Ask.
Yep, I've read it.
And part of,
See
yes,
what I'm
right. It's
referencing. Yes,
exactly. Yeah. We just
such an important
hope
body
that
of work.
people will notice that we're good and offer us better pay. Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
If I just work harder, they'll see me.
Doesn't normally
Awesome.
work that way. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm going to launch into some of the questions that I had prepared, but if this
Sure.
is a completely different track, that is
Oh, it's
absolutely
okay.
okay.
No, but there's gender differences with moral injury as well. So, but yeah.
Yes, yes. Okay, so we know that this, the study of moral injury has been being conducted for several decades, and you, as we discussed, have been working in this field for about a decade and a half.
Yeah.
But as we talk to individuals, we know that this is still a very new concept for many of our listeners. And there's lots of definitions.
Right.
Um, People have different definitions for this. So, as one of the leading experts, we would love to hear, your definition of the concept of moral injury.
Mm-hmm.
And and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into what you've learned about its impact on combat veterans and other populations. So, for
Yeah.
starters, what is your definition of moral injury?
Yeah, well, let me begin by saying anybody with a conscience will have a moral conflict, sometimes several a day. If you have a conscience and things bother you, you try to figure out how to deal with them. And often if it's something wrong you've done, you apologize or you try to make it right. And the same if people do that to you, they try to make it right. That's how we establish normal, healthy relationships, is our conscience guides us. And so that's not an unusual thing, but sometimes you hit a moral conflict you can't fix. Like, it's the damage is done. Just, you have to figure out, maybe you can make recompense or do something, but to write or receive an apology or something. But sometimes the unfixability of something, or a whole lot of moral conflicts that pile up that you can't deal with, can cause you moral distress. So you may actually start losing sleep, or it can affect the quality of your life. Those are all normal, regular things that happen to human beings. But if you get too much of that, or something catastrophic happens, like one huge thing, like I've talked to a group of people who have killed someone in a car accident, how terrible they feel about it. You can get to the point where you doubt your own goodness, where you wonder who you are as a decent person. Um, you would think maybe what you used to believe doesn't work for you anymore. That's moral injury, where you're in an identity crisis, your meanings and values are challenged and threatened. And it's painful. It's very painful. You can have feelings of guilt or shame, or outrage, that anger at something else that was morally violated, that makes you really angry. And to deal with those feelings is hard work. And so a lot of people just try to set them aside and keep going. But as one person said, if you bury those feelings, they don't die. They just sit in there and stew. And that's what I would call moral injury, is that sense that you're carrying something pretty horrible, and you haven't figured out how to deal with it, and it's weighing you down to the point that you may avoid it by overworking, drinking too much, taking drugs, thinking about killing yourself, avoiding relationships that remind you of things that might provoke you to have to address those things. So it's a serious suffering, but it's not a disorder, because you're actually responding to a real thing. Right. So I there's a sort of dispute going on in people who work on this, whether it should get a diagnosis and a protocol so it can be treated. And because it's often occurs with trauma or with PTSD or other things, I think it gets confused with them. But you can have moral injury and not have any of those things,
Right.
and suffer a lot. So but the crazy thing, I think, in terms of that, is if you're suffering that way because of some devastating experience, it actually means the good part of you wants back out.
Right.
So it's not that you're broken or disordered, it's that you just suffer. And suffering is awful. So but the only way to get past a burden of that suffering, it's not like you can erase what happened. It's not going to go away if you feel better. So you have to figure out how to process it and accept it in a way that it doesn't run your life. And that takes time. It takes trusting someone else, or trusting in some way that helps you process it. And so we've developed, Jonathan Shea, who coined the term in 1994, moral injury. He actually worked with us, along with 7 other experts, to create a moral injury processing program that we developed before the pandemic. It ran a 2-year pilot, then we had to shut it down because of the pandemic, because it was in person. But what we did was create small groups with veterans facilitating the groups to help people process moral injury, and we got pretty good results. And by the way, our first group was all women.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah, I I appreciate the conflict between DSM or not DSM, and
Yeah.
I can see the benefits of both,
Yeah.
but for me, it's like, as soon as you put something into DSM, you automatically restrict it to a a finite criteria that has to be met,
Yeah.
and you're going to leave out a whole lot of stuff.
Yep.
For one thing, we haven't really researched and dug into moral injury in enough context and enough things and enough people. And the other thing is, well, what do you do with all the other people that don't meet the criteria that are still suffering?
Suffering, that's
So
right. Yeah.
yeah, so I'm
Yeah.
not a fan of putting in the DSM, but I
Yeah.
do understand where people are coming from. But it's the chance to, like, from a VA perspective, get a rating, get some funding, get some
Yeah.
specific support. But I think the cost, in terms of the human cost, or the you know outweighs that.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's also
so
true that I think moral suffering is an ancient affliction. And there
right,
are actually other cultures that have ways of dealing with it that aren't the medicalized Western model, which
right,
is one model, right? But and I actually appreciate the VA clinicians, like this woman Shira McGann. She actually studies gendered issues for veterans,
right.
but also like the Brett Litz team, where they've actually suggested a protocol, sort of a treatment program for clinicians who are already treating veterans who have like PTSD or an actual mental health diagnosis, that you can help them deal with the impact of killing or the affliction of conscience by using a different method embedded in the therapy process, but it isn't the prescribed therapy for PTSD, for example. So in McGann's impact of killing protocol, she suggests to clinicians, if you have a combat veteran who's talking about having killed, you can assume they might have some moral injury around that, because they have double the suicide rates of other veterans. So they know that's a major suffering. So she says, so you aren't going to fix it. You aren't going to take back what happened. So you have to treat it in terms of like accepting it. And so she has a 10-step protocol that includes things like writing a letter of apology for the harm you did and things like that. Which I, it's like, that's really helpful if you are a psychiatrist or a clinician and you don't understand what this is necessarily going on with your veteran. If you're treating them, that this might be an issue, and then you can explore it with them. But someone who is just experiencing moral injury, feeling miserable about something that happened, um, they may benefit from something else. So I have a colleague that I met at a humanities seminar on veterans, who's an Iraq veteran who was treated by the VA for PTSD. He said that PTSD treatments were really helpful for managing his symptoms, but he still felt miserable. That something in him felt utterly miserable, and he couldn't figure out why. And somebody told him about this Lakota sweat lodge process, and that there were some Lakota leaders who were willing to have non-Lakota veterans in their program. So he went to that. And that process is what finally got to that sense of how miserable he felt. He felt so much better after going through that, because it was in a group with other veterans. It was just a very different process than the PTSD treatments. So, and I think that that's just that there are cultures and ways of being that sometimes can supplement or replace what the Western medicalized model tries to do. And when we work with moral injury, we try to attend to all these multiplicities. So, and a lot of the people we train are social workers and chaplains. So we like to give them a good, as it were, arsenal of things to try. Because not everything works for everyone. Someone else might
Right.
go to a sweat lodge and not experience it as all that helpful. So it's not a one size fits all. I had an argument once with a psychiatrist about the way we were trying to do this sort of multidisciplinary approach, and he said, and I said, we use some ritual things, and he said, well, ritual doesn't work for everyone, and I said, well, neither does psychotherapy. And then he said, well, yeah, that's true. So,
Right.
right. So even the ones that are evidence-based don't, they're statistical, and the it's the middle that you get with the statistics. You don't get the miracle stories or the failures.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So
I I
yeah, I
I
think,
appreciate that a lot.
yeah,
Because, just in my own experience, when I retired, I had already done, clinical type psychotherapy and cognitive based therapy.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and in some ways it was triggering for me to go do that again
Hmm.
with somebody new, because I didn't want to have to share my story again and and it's just that experience is really hard. But
Yeah.
the things that I went and pursued, first of all, I went with an open mind and an open heart, which helps,
Yeah.
when you're going into a situation that you don't really want to put yourself in.
Yeah.
You kind of close your mind and your heart off. So
Yeah.
I went did different, healing modalities, and just the feeling of um, relaxation and open mindedness and unconditional support and feeling believed and
Yeah.
seen, and
Yeah.
not having to justify
Yeah.
why I was feeling the way that I was feeling. That was very healing for me. And so, Dan and I have extensive conversations about how can we pull in as many modalities as possible, and basically
Yeah.
offer a smorgasbord to
Yeah.
anybody who comes to us to say, this is what this is. You can
Hmm.
try it. If it helps, that's great. If it doesn't, we've got other options. We don't want to just be a one size
Yeah.
fits all solution, because that's just
Yeah. Yeah.
not
And
my experience. Mhm.
veterans have so many different ways they recover from their experiences. There isn't a, I mean, there's different cultures, there's different personality type. I mean, it's just, human suffering is a complex thing.
It's
Yeah.
very unique to every single individual. That's Everybody's got a
Yeah.
lens by which they
Yeah.
perceive.
The thing we found is, especially with veterans who shared military culture, they have some sense of a shared past experience
Mhm.
where they will, if they're with people who shared that, they are more willing to trust
Hmm.
a group of other veterans without a civilian or a fix-it person in the room.
Hmm.
And so we do all of our programs as peer facilitated, and we
Mm.
just train the veterans on how to run the program. And I think there's something magical about going through a horrifying process of coughing up your moral injury and trying to process it and tell the story and all of that when you're in a group that believes you, doesn't think you're bad, doesn't judge you, but really empathizes. And that process with the group somehow has this capacity to help people get better without the individual having to do it themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
You actually feel the whole group shifting, and you shift with the
Yeah.
group, which is really different from therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know we had a veteran go through our program who had been under psychiatric care for 27 years. This
Mm.
is what he told us. And he said, you did in 5 days what 27 years of psychotherapy wasn't able to do. He said, I feel like myself again.
Yeah.
He said, how did you
Wow.
do that? I didn't want to explain to him, but I said, well, we didn't do it. Your group did it for you.
Right.
It carried you until you could get there.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So could you share some other examples of initiatives that your organization is undertaking, specifically your recovery programs at
Well,
volunteer?
we have several.
Okay.
We're in the process of trying to restart our what I call Cadillac or flagship program that we did the pilot on for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's an extensive retreat-based 50-hour program, and I think that's our especially effective for people who are carrying other traumas.
Yes.
So with the first, when we ran that pilot, as I said, our first group was female. Everyone was female, and I think they were in an affordable housing system that Volunteers of America ran, where it was for veterans with children.
Mm.
And so some of them have been recently unhoused, and living in their cars and things. So they were struggling with a lot of issues. It wasn't just well, no, I wouldn't say just moral injury, but that was one of the things they were struggling with. And we didn't expect our first group to be all women. It just happened to turn out that way. And we had trained a male and female to facilitate the group. And then we got nervous about the possibilities of military sexual trauma and whether those women would be comfortable talking about that with a male facilitator. And so we told them it's fine if you don't want him to be in the group. He won't take that personally. We want you to be comfortable and safe sharing. If he's okay now, but later on you decide you don't want him there for a certain part of the time, that's okay too. So that they would feel okay around if they had military sexual trauma. And there were stories that of military sexual trauma that surfaced in the group, but they never asked him to leave, and in fact they liked him just fine. So that was kind of heartening to me, that it was okay. And at the end of the week, they asked if they could have a session in the evening to burn all the things they needed to let go of, which was a wonderful ritual they helped us design, where each one wrote the list in the afternoon, and then they came to the ritual with a piece of paper with everything written so they could put it in the fire and watch it burn away. And one of the startling things was that a member of the group read the letter she wrote to her rapist, forgiving him. And it was really powerful. Not every woman in the group felt that they needed to forgive, but that was what she needed to do, and she was able to accomplish that in the group. Another woman shared, and this wasn't confidential in the group, it was at the burn, and we were all invited to be there, but she also shared about the traumas from her own childhood, which were pretty severe. And what she said, and she also included in that what happened to her in the military, which she was sexually assaulted in the military and also went to prison. So I mean, this was a list of traumas that I couldn't believe one person had survived. And but what she said was, I realized this week that I have had so much pain in my life that I did not feel like myself if I wasn't in pain.
Yeah.
And she said, I realized this week I do not have to be in pain. So I am burning my pain.
That's awesome.
So there were things like that, right? And we had high hopes for this program. They were our very first group. What they did was so amazing to me. It made me believe that this really would help. And so, and it wound, and we had a science, we did the evidence-based piece as well. They filled out surveys. And the results were actually better than my expectations for the program.
Yeah.
So that made me, that sense of being in a group, being believed, to the point that you would share the most awful things from your life and be able to unload some of that and process it in a way that it no longer, as it were, caused you to live in a constant state of pain. Is a really powerful gift they gave each other.
Yeah. So the retreat programming and creating the intentional space and time.
We're working on restarting that, but we do have spaces online, because when the pandemic started, we realized we needed to do something. But we also knew that people weren't going to have 50 hours. So we actually created a 1-hour program based on what the facilitators for our huge programs said. If you only had people for an hour, how would you help them? And so they gave us some advice, and we put together a 1-hour processing program called Resilient Strength Time. And it's REST, R-E-S-T is the short term for it. It's called REST. and it's free and it's online, and we have meetings for veterans only every week.
Okay.
And if a group of women wanted to go and sign up for a group together, they could create their own group, and it's facilitated by veterans.
That sounds wonderful.
And there's been some interesting relative, like last year, some research published around moral injury and some of the ways that gender impacts moral injury. And Jonathan Shea was the one that defined moral injury as being betrayed by someone in authority who violates what's right in a high stakes situation.
Right.
And you could consider military sexual trauma also a kind of betrayal when it's somebody in your unit, you're supposed to be able to trust them to have your back and protect your life. And so when they assault you, it's devastating. It's just a devastating betrayal. And it turns out that women veterans have a pretty complicated relationship to betrayal as moral injury that relates partly to experiences of military sexual trauma, and partly the genderized nature of military experience can be hard on women sometimes too. So in terms of men, evidently, the form of moral injury that's most devastating is perpetration, where they do something like kill someone or do something that they have a very strong reaction to perpetration, more so than betrayal. It's sort of flipped gender-wise, that women have a stronger relationship to betrayal. They also have higher rates of attempting to die by suicide than men do. So those are all gendered factors in the way moral injury works.
Yeah. Okay, so my next question is with regard to the Soul Repair Center, which you founded, focused on research and education related to moral injury and recovery. What were some of the most significant findings and insights that emerged from that center's work?
Well, the research we did was on the piece that I just talked about. So we also try to stay on top of the literature. There's just a huge amount of literature out there. So we created at our website a resources page that is curated and updated all the time as new research is published on moral injury. And we bring that material into the certificate program we offer. We have a 50-hour, 10-week certificate program in moral injury work. And so we get chaplains and social workers and clinicians and clergy and college professors. There's been an interesting array of people who've come in to take that certificate program. And so what we provide them with is the research we've done on what's current in moral injury work. And we have lectures provided by various experts in areas that help inform them in that multidisciplinary way. So we have Buddhist approaches to moral injury. We have Muslim approaches to moral injury, Jewish approaches to moral injury lectures. We have stuff that's more clinically oriented. We have stuff that's more religiously oriented, so that people can get that array of a sense of what's out there. So our research is around what's out there, as well as the research we did, and we're also trying to create a new research project to test several versions of that program that we created originally. But the thing that's also awesome is in that certificate program, the people come in, they do their own research, and then they create a capstone project that they want to take back and try out in their workplace based on their own research. So we've had really interest, like, for example, this was a thing I would never have thought of, is that a woman who was a chaplain at a psychiatric hospital noticed that people who got better, who were getting ready to be discharged, so now they've been helped from their mental health diagnosis, they've gotten better. She said they started to get moral injury as they were leaving because they started to feel terrible about what they had done to their families. And so she thought maybe I should have a moral injury program for people being discharged. So she
Wow.
set up a small group process that people could do for a few weeks as they were getting ready to leave the hospital, so that they would understand what the experience of feeling miserable after you've gotten better is. And it also made me wonder sometimes how you hear about when people are deeply depressed, as they take antidepressants, they start to feel better. They're more likely to die by suicide at that point. And that made me wonder, well, maybe it's because they have the energy to feel terrible and guilty about things. All right, they're too depressed, they're just flat. But as they emerge from that, so that was such a like it was a way of thinking about getting better from a mental illness that I had never even considered, that you might actually suffer from getting better.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I
That
love,
works with often with alcohol. In AA, people have to face into the harm they've done.
yeah,
Right.
So I think that there's those kind of paradoxes that come out of this certificate program, but also just we have military chaplains who are trying to set up programs that help military chaplains with moral injury, because we don't it's like chaplains are supposed to help everybody else, but you can also experience it yourself.
Right.
So there's lots of things like that,
Right.
that I think are really important dimensions of understanding moral injury, that people who seem strong and competent may have serious cases of it.
Yeah.
absolutely.
That's
As
right.
a way of overcompensating for their guilt and shame, they try to work harder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I I can relate to that.
Yes. And the
Um,
other one that's awful is toxic anger.
yeah,
That sense of being outraged and not being able to trust anybody, and living in a state of stewing in anger. It's just really bad for you physically as well as emotionally.
for
Yeah.
sure. For sure.
Yeah.
And the thing about what's interesting about anger is, as someone who in the past struggled a lot with toxic anger, um, is it energizes you, right?
Yeah.
So you can get this sense of high and power from your anger, and once you experience that, it's very difficult to let go of it. And so people start talking about loving and forgiving and caring about people. That sounds soft and weak,
Yeah.
and like you're giving up the thing that empowers you to do, especially since you can succeed and achieve a lot with that anger. Eventually it's going to get you.
Yeah.
Eventually it's going to exhaust you. It's going to spiritually, you know, um, it's like it's like, having a credit card with a big, you have a big limit on it, and you're spending. Eventually you're going to run out of limit, and
Yeah.
then you're going to be in trouble. You're not going to be able to pay whatever. So that kind of anger, can be very helpful at a certain period of your life, especially if you come out of a period maybe of disempowerment.
Mm-hmm.
Like for kids, like leaving home, maybe they were at home very disempowered, and then you join the military, right? Thinking you're going to get to be
Yeah.
your own person or whatever, but you develop this anger, and that anger serves you well. As someone who spent many years in the infantry, I like to say we hated everybody, we were angry at everybody and everything all the time. But that's not totally true. But even our esprit de corps was often anger based, right? So
Yeah.
so like that anger can really serve you well, but at some point it just depletes your soul, your spirit, however you want to think about it mentally. And then where do you go now, especially if you leave that organization or that place where the anger is so useful, and you want to try to go do something else, or have good relationships, a good marriage, and all that kind of thing, then it doesn't serve you very well. But can be difficult to let go of because you've used it as an empowerment mechanism for
Yeah.
so long. So
Yeah.
that's a little bit of a sidebar, but it's just
No, it's
that
true.
anger. It's a good point to mention that people don't think about.
Yeah, it certainly affected me and my family. My father came home from Vietnam after a second tour dramatically changed in a way that I didn't. He was mean and controlling, and I didn't want to be around him. And so and I was angry at him for the way he was treating me. So I decided not to live at home again because I was just started college when he came home from Vietnam.
Mhm.
And it took me years to realize how alienated I was from the rest of my family because I wouldn't live at home anymore
Yeah.
because I
Yeah.
didn't want to be around him. And he actually died of a heart attack 8 years after he returned from Vietnam. And we never had a conversation about any of this. He just died. I was in Switzerland. I went as far as going all the way to Europe to get away from him. I don't think I was consciously thinking in those terms, but I, it was a person I was with at the time got a postdoc in Switzerland, so I went with him. Um, didn't think for a minute what it meant to leave my family for 2 years
Mhm.
or to leave the U.S. for 2 years. So yeah, it's that kind of. I think I realized he had moral injury. It took me a long time to figure that out, and one of the reasons I work on moral injury is it's so impacted my life and family because I had a veteran for a father who was deeply impacted by a terrible war. He also fought at Normandy as an automatic rifleman, and
My
but
goodness.
but when he met my mother, he'd come home. He made it through the end of the war. They sent him home to Walter Reed and gave him electroshock, and so then they sent him home to Mississippi, and he was there. I think it kind of catatonic for about 6 months, and then he slowly recovered. So by the time he came to Japan and met my mother, he was as recovered as you could be from that kind of an experience. He was fine. I'm not fine, but he was functioning and managed to have a good life with my mom. And then Vietnam, uh, 2 tours there just wrecked him again.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I thank you for sharing that because that was my next question. I realized it was a little bit more personal, so I'm glad
yeah,
that you brought that up. But I I have found as we discussed earlier, the incredible people that find themselves in this work um, typically have a big reason
yeah,
why.
yeah,
People that end up being cancer doctors, it's because somebody in their family had, that was very important to them, died of cancer
yeah,
or, struggled. So you sharing your father's story about him, I'm sure had something to do with it. I'm also
yeah,
curious, as a theologian, how does your background and expertise in that and your
yeah.
own culture inform your understanding of moral injury and its potential?
It's an interesting question. I've had to think about that a lot because it's a sort of odd thing for me to have wandered into a PhD in theology after I went to college to be a neurosurgeon. I was a pre-med.
Oh, wow.
Um,
That's so interesting.
but I think partly it was the influence of a Japanese grandfather who was really deeply part of my life. I lived with my mother and I lived with my grandparents, and my grandfather was a Buddhist priest.
Mm,
And I think that how I was treated by my grandparents with kindness and care made coming to the United States to Fort Riley, Kansas, a bit of a culture shock. um,
I went to Fort
and
Riley, Kansas, and it
did
was
you? Well, I
a
did
shock.
first to sixth grade in Fort Riley, Kansas, and so American culture was just very different. But I
Yeah.
remember going to Sunday school and base chapel because my stepfather was a Protestant, and hearing this thing about how if you didn't believe that Jesus died for you, you'd go to hell and whatever, and that only the people who believed in Jesus would get to heaven. And I remember thinking, oh, I just rather be with my grandparents wherever they were. And so Christianity didn't make a lot of sense to me as anything I wanted to be part of for a long time. And I had a really great Baptist minister in high school that was different. He was very loving and kind. And anyway, I wound up getting baptized, but I wasn't what you would call particularly pious or religious, and I wasn't that interested in continuing with that until I got to college, and the intellectual study of the Bible and the history and the theological questions were interesting to me enough that, and I was involved in the civil rights movement also in college, and that so there was a convergence of the justice and mercy traditions around Jesus and Judaism that hooked me to realize, oh, this kind of concern for the well-being of other people and human suffering is a very old tradition, and that that working to stop the Vietnam War, working for racial justice, wasn't something ephemeral and new. It was really grounded in a very, very long human history of care. So I got interested in religion that way. I had a great professor talk me into grad school in religion. That's how I got into religion. But my project from the time I entered seminary to the time, well, to still, is to challenge the whole idea that God is the kind of God that would require torture and murder for people to be saved.
Yeah.
And that idea that the crucifixion of Jesus Christ was some kind of saving event sanctifies violence. And so my project has been to challenge that idea. And the last theological book I wrote in 2008 called Saving Paradise was that I discovered that for the first 1,000 years of Christian history, they really didn't believe that. That got imposed as an ideology by penalty of death during the Crusades as a kind of war propaganda.
Wow.
And that was such a relief, because I kept trying to decide, could I really be a Christian and hang in there with? I just, it was a really difficult struggle I was in. And luckily I belonged to a church that thought that struggle was fine. That's made you Christian, didn't make you not Christian. So the doubt is good, because it leads you to think about things and not just accept them pro forma. But so, yeah, I have, so for me, it's been this core moral question: is God a moral being if God has to do that?
Yeah.
We need 2 or 3 more podcasts, obviously, because that's
we
do.
So that's
that
that's
one I
my
would love to do a whole bunch of conversations about that, because I love that idea, and that's something some readings I've been doing and thinking about it too, that has totally changed my old view, which I grew up in a very conservative Christian background, and a lot of good people in that background, but that theological question, which we don't have time to go into today, but it's huge,
but
super
my Baptist
important.
minister in high school certainly believed that and wanted me to get baptized. And he stayed my friend until he died. But just because he was the kind of minister who was loving and accepting regardless.
Right.
Yeah.
And so for me, that the core heart that he had was about love, not about punishment. And in fact, as he was dying, he said to me, "I have a question I need to ask you." And he said, "I'm going to not be around much longer, and I want to make sure that everybody I love is going to be in heaven with me." And he said, "Do you still have your faith?" And I said, he said, "Because I know you've been educated and you've got, you've moved far." And I said, "I have moved far, but you being in your church and having you baptize me grounded me in my faith in God that has never failed. So I'll see you in heaven." I didn't tell him I believed everybody was going to heaven.
Right.
Yeah.
That's called universalism, that there's no heaven. Whatever we go in the afterlife, we're all going to be there. And if we don't get along here, we're going to have to figure it out there next.
He might have struggled with that a little bit.
Yeah, he might have, but I don't know that he would have. I mean, I think I sincerely meant that, that he established this relationship to a loving God for me in a way that was no one else had done, and I appreciated that. So but I did want my grandparents, my Japanese grandparents, wherever I'm going, I want them too to come along.
That's true.
I think they're there to welcome me wherever I'm going. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
But that's, that is I've now learned all of that is very Christian. They, the early church believed that the resurrection of Jesus was what validated his life and ministry, and that the crucifixion was tragic and horrible, but it didn't defeat their movement and it didn't erase them, that he returned and that he brought life. And they actually believed that the relationship between the living and the dead was a close relationship, that the dead visited and Jesus was part of that. So this idea that there was this hard deadline of separation after death and you would never see anybody again until you died, they didn't have that view of death. And so they also believe that the earthly paradise was actually here, that Genesis really meant it. They said that creation was blessed and there was a special world for human beings to take care of each other. And the second century theologian said the church is planted as the paradise in this world. That's the mission of the church, is to help humans flourish. But anyway, I don't want to get that.
No,
so
but it's it's an interesting thing to discuss, because on the topic of moral injury, as you know, a lot of people fall away from their faith because of some of these hard line, all or nothing mentalities within religious spaces. And it's, people can't even receive the good parts of it anymore because it has anything to do with church or, the word God or any of those things. And so, again, like in your work as a theologian, helping people even navigate that part, what are some of the things that you've seen out there that have been able to help people come back to the good parts of religion or faith?
One of my students at Bright Divinity School, who's now a senior minister, has a PhD in theology from Emory, was an Iraq vet who had moral injury serious enough that it threatened his life. He really grappled with these questions as a Christian theologian, and one of his heroes was a World War II German soldier who was a prisoner of war in England, who was utterly humiliated as a German when they lost the war, and he found out all the things that Germany had done, and he went through this theologian went through horrible suffering, and went back and became a powerful theologian. He's a major figure in the 20th century. And I think this is a really important piece of understanding what the crucifixion means. If it isn't a thing that saves everybody, if it isn't necessary for salvation, but we accept that it happened and try to understand what it meant if Jesus was the embodiment of divinity and humanity. Like, in other words, his divinity is also our humanity. That's the gift we become aware of in knowing who he is. That his crucifixion, what he claimed was, in the crucifixion, God also died. That in other words, there is nowhere a human being can go that God does not go with us. And so this theologian wrote a book called The Crucified God, which just freaked everybody out, because they kept trying to say, well, the human part of him died, but the divine part of him didn't, because God is immortal. And he just said, you can't do that to Jesus. How he suffered was awful. And did it get through it? Yes, because God went through the whole process, even dying. And that meant a lot to my student.
I see it as a very, like, the most powerful example of forgiveness.
Well, it's interesting. He didn't actually forgive the people who killed him. He asked God to forgive them.
Yeah, that's true
right?
too.
He says, I really would like this to pass. I would like not to go through this. And eventually he says, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing.
Right.
and so that's very, like, it gives you space
Mhm.
to think about when you should forgive and maybe when you need to turn that over to God. Or I mean, there's because I don't think you can prescribe it. People have to get to it. My friend
Oh,
who
right.
was
You
right.
definitely
Right.
can't should somebody. You can't say you
Yeah,
should
yeah.
for, you don't have to do
Yeah.
anything you don't want to do. And it's a process and it's a
It is a
journey.
process, and it may not be the end product of the process.
Exactly.
My friend who was sexually abused when she was 4, we wrote a book together, and she describes this, and it's called Proverbs of Ashes. She said that she finally got 6 years of therapy in her. When she was like 40, she got to a place of remembering
Hmm.
the terror she felt that caused her to be in a state of suspended trauma for her whole life until that moment. And how horror, when she came to that, she was finally able to grapple with it. And so somebody asked her about, I think at a book reading, asked her about forgiveness, and she said it's not a concept she related to in what happened. She's learned to accept it.
Mm.
It's part of what, but she didn't really know that she was 4 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the person died a long time ago. Um, and so she said, I don't think about it as forgiveness. And uh, an Iraq veteran friend of mine said, he said, I don't think about what I did as being forgiven, because I didn't know the person. I have no one to ask no one to apologize to that I know. And I think I wouldn't be a moral person if I forgave myself for killing someone.
Mm. It's very
That's
interesting.
his approach. I mean, not everybody comes to that conclusion, but that's the last time I talked to him, which has been a while. He might have changed his mind. He might have decided forgiveness fits now, but at the time I talked to him, he just said, I don't want to forgive myself. I should feel terrible I killed someone.
Yeah.
I said it just doesn't have to run my life, but when I think about it, I always feel terrible about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah,
Well,
there's no like one, as I said, no
yeah.
one thing that works and no one answer at the end of the process that helps you continue to want to live
Yeah.
and restores you to what I think of as recovery is that you are able again to feel joy and pleasure and curiosity and gratitude and wonder.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
are the feelings that you lose when you're in a state of suffering moral injury.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's why we're, the comprehensive moral injury conference that's coming up,
Yeah.
this is the space to really take the time to have these sorts of conversations and build those strategic synergistic partnerships,
Yeah.
um, and that will have long lasting and far reaching impacts. And that's probably one of the things that Dan and I are most excited about, is just creating the intentional time and space for the
Yeah.
sharing of the research, and to have some of these very deep, very existential conversations to better inform our work. um and we're so humbled and thrilled for the Volunteers of America and the Shea Learning Center's sponsorship this year. I'm curious what you are most looking forward to about the conference, and what outcomes you're most hoping for.
I'm hoping that people will understand that moral injury is evidence of the goodness in you,
Mm,
that
yeah.
you wouldn't be suffering like that if there wasn't that core heart, and that living with a broken heart is awful. And so the process is trying to figure out how to heal a broken heart.
Yeah.
That's one thing I hope you're not bad. You're not a bad person. You're not you're not mentally ill
Right.
necessarily. That kind of moral suffering is how we know we're a good person when awful things happen. Um,
Right.
and that you don't have to stay in that state of suffering if you can find a way to tell your story, to be with others who believe you, and will help carry you as you recover. That's really, really important. But the thing I look forward to is meeting all the amazing people that I get to meet doing this work. Really, it just astonishes me when people realize what moral injury is and they start to examine it and come to terms with it. Um, what amazing people show up out of that process.
Yeah.
That's another thing that we're looking forward to is we already have this incredible lineup of people I could listen to for days on end, but then the people that are interested in it and wanting to learn more and their curiosity and their questions that will just continue to stir the conversation and the research is I get goosebumps when I think about it. So
Great.
very, very
Great.
excited. And again, thank you
Yeah.
so much for contributing to the success of this event. We're looking forward to working with you and your organization for years to come. And
Yeah.
it really has been such a pleasure. So before I, officially wrap up the conversation for our podcast today, Dan, did you have anything else that you would like to state or to share with Dr. Brock or with our audience?
Yeah, thanks again, Dr. Brock, for coming, and what a great conversation. One of the things I love about doing these podcasts is I always learn something. I always feel better about myself and my own life, or take something away that I go, I can, and I always come away thinking, need a couple more hours. So with you, there's no exception.
Yeah.
Um, it's been a great conversation. Some really deep ideas that I hope people will really sit with. Like, listen to this, pause it, sit with it, think about it, and really, you mentioned a couple of great books that I hope people really go out and get. Hope they go to your website, VOA and VOA.org, right?
Yep.
And just see all the great stuff that's available. I'm super excited about the conference and your sponsorship of it, and just the continuing conversations and relationships, and how we can work together as organizations, as people, to really, um, the number one thing, you said it, like, help people feel better, restore that place of joy, find that place of joy if they never had it. Some people have never really had real joy in their life because from the very beginning of childhood it's been traumatic. But my own spiritual belief is we have that spark of God there. God is in us, and it's sometimes just a matter of uncovering the fog and getting to that place of divinity. And so there are many ways to go about that. Your organization and you personally are doing some amazing work, and I'm just super thankful that you joined us today, and
Well, it
we're
was
looking
a pleasure to
forward to
be
seeing
with
you in
you.
September and everything. So
Yeah. It's a pleasure. Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. So for those that are listening, the information about our upcoming Comprehensive Moral Injury Conference, September 17th through the 20th, at the St. Ignatius House, will be in the notes following the podcast, as well as links to the VOA.org website, Volunteers of America, and Dr. Brock's work there. And we just want to thank everybody once again for joining us for another edition of our podcast. And again, Dr. Brock, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.